Hello, everybody. Looks like I'm freezing a little bit, but you know what? We'll get in one way or another. Um, just talk crazy for a minute. So today we are in Mondays with Mark. We got Mark chapter 2, 13 through 17. Just jumping in here, I want to read it, give you a little idea about some interesting things that Mark is doing with storytelling, and then just jump into some of the words and terms being used to talk about the people that are gathered around Jesus and what that might help us to see as far as what Mark is trying to tell us about this was and who Jesus ministered to and what his kingdom and preaching was about. All right, so Mark 2:13 through 17. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but the sinners." All right. So there you go. Mark 2:13 through 17. So the first thing I want to talk about is from Talbert's book, Sowing the Gospel, where she lays out an outline of the first part of Mark up to this point. And what you will notice is, if you go back to chapter 1, 16 through 20, so right after the prologue, where it says, in 14 and 15, Jesus goes out to proclaim the kingdom. And then in 16 through 20, he passes along the sea and calls the first disciples. And then there's a series of 4 healings that take place. There's one in a synagogue. There's one in Simon's house. There's the leper, and then the paralytic that we had in 2:1 through 12 that we talked about last week when Leonard was with us. So that takes to 2:1 through 12, and then beginning in this verse, again, you have another walking beside the sea and a calling of Levi. And then through chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, you have 4 controversy stories. So the first one here is eating with sinners. There'll be another one about fasting. Then there's one about Sabbath observance. And then it ends with a controversy over the Sabbath, but then also another healing. So one thing I want to say right away about this is that we just think that Mark has, dipped in and just, kind of tried to report a straight life of Jesus. This is how I remember it, Mark is doing much more than that. Mark is telling a very specific story and trying hard to lay it out in a way that has the symmetry and would have worked well to not only read it, but also to speak it orally as well. And I won't get into the whole setting of these recitations of these gospels, which I did a whole THM on the banquet setting, which we see in this text is the setting of the early church and the setting of this text are the same, the gathering around a table and having conversation and hearing the Gospels read. That's what you should have in your mind when you hear these texts of the New Testament. People gathered around in homes or in small meeting houses, having dinner together and listening to these stories. But I'll save that for another day. But important to look at this. I knew that was about to happen. I'm about to lose my camera. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what the deal is. I think it should come back. Come on back. Sorry about that noise. I still don't know why it's not coming back. Apologize. Well. All right. Well, anyway, let me turn it over here and see what I can get. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why it's happening, but so that really threw me off. But we'll come back again to this idea of, okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Let's see. Now we're back in the way that I'm used to and can feel comfortable with. All right, sorry about that. So anyway, we have these two stories, two calling stories, one of the disciples and then one of this Levi character. And then you have with the first set of disciples a set of healings, and then after Levi a set of controversies. And this text starts off too with this word of Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him. And it's interesting, this word crowd, it oklos in Greek, kind of represents this kind of a lower class, like in the sense of the what we might call, like the working class or the poor of our day. This is that kind of group of people who this term crowd gets kind of thrown out to talk about this kind of mass of people who kind of find themselves in opposition to the elites, like the Pharisees and the scribes and these the priests and the people from the city. And so when you see this word crowd, there's kind of a weight behind it, and a different kind of feel behind it that we need to pick up on, and it helps us to hear kind of what Mark is talking about. And in the same group, the crowd is also in chapter 2 at the beginning, and in verse 4 as well. And we don't need to go much further into that at this point, but then you have Levi, who is a tax collector sitting in a tax booth, who gets told to follow me and comes with Jesus. And it's interesting because it says that many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. So it's one thing, to have Jesus call this one tax collector Levi, who in Matthew's gospel gets changed into Matthew, but it's unclear what happens to this person, this Levi. and whether that is actually who it is Matthew. But you have this tax collector and sinners refrain that keeps getting repeated in this text. And so the interesting question is, who are these tax collectors and sinners? Now, the tax collectors were disliked by a lot of people. So and would have been disliked, it would seem, by many of the crowd as well. One interesting thing that I think it's Ched Myers talks about is how it seems like one of the main roles of someone who would be called a tax collector who was Jewish at this time would have been the one in charge of regulating the fishing business. So keeping the licenses up and paying all the things. This wouldn't be necessarily someone directly under the Roman government, but a step or two removed. So it's interesting that you have the call of the fishermen at the beginning, and then in the world of the hearers of these words, of the readers of these words, originally they might have even heard these two characters that played a role in along the sea, of the workers, and then these tax collectors who were regulating this business on behalf of empire. So interesting dynamic there, because all of these people end up kind of sitting together in one way or another, and it seems like an interesting mix of people. and then you have the term sinners thrown on top of that. And so if sinners is a big category, part of that big category is tax collectors. So tax collectors is a group within the group of sinners, but sinners seems to be a broader category that we're talking about, with Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners. And I was kind of, the idea of sin and sinners in Mark is kind of interesting. We heard it's the term for sin and sinners is not really mentioned that much in the Gospel of Mark. We would maybe think that there's a lot of talk about sin in any gospel in any gospel text, but the actual use of the word sin and sinners doesn't happen much. Now, the first time you hear about sins is in the context of John's baptism in chapter 1. And you may remember that it talks about John's baptism being for repentance and the forgiveness of sins. And then it talks about many coming to him, confessing their sins and being baptized. And Dr. Blunt, in his Go Preach, will talk about how John's baptism is different than Jesus's baptism, in the sense that John's baptism specifically talks about the forgiveness of sins and the negation of sin, whereas Jesus's baptism talks about repentance, but it doesn't talk about for the forgiveness of sins. So there's a difference there in that. And then the word sin doesn't pop up again until the story that we read last week in chapter 2, where there's this back and forth with Jesus saying that the paralytic sins are forgiven, and telling him to get up and take his mat as if his body was healed. And then there being a problem with that on the part of the scribes and Pharisees there, saying you can't, you're not supposed to say that, like only God can forgive sins. But Jesus, so the word sin is mentioned a number of times in that little text, but it's all in the same context of Jesus healing and forgiving sins, almost as if those terms are synonymous together. And so then the next time you get the mention of sinners, well, and actually the first time talking about sinners instead of forgiveness of sins is in this text here, where Jesus is eating with these sinners, and of course the scribes of the Pharisees say that you shouldn't do that, and Jesus says, they go back and forth, and so you mention the word sinners maybe 4 or 5 times in the gospel, but almost all of them come in this little bit of text here, and it's quite unclear what exactly this means. Who is being talked about here? Who are sinners? Like I said, tax collectors clearly fit in that category. But again, sinners doesn't appear again. In 838, it talks about a sinful generation, which has a very similar word. But the word sinners doesn't appear again until 1441, where it says the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of sinners. When Jesus is talking about his crucifixion. So it's interesting because clearly there is a way that this word sinners in the gospel refers to people who we might say do bad things or are a part of a system that is corrupt and evil, and they're participating in that, because Jesus says that the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners, clearly saying something negative about sinners. And even the mention of this sinful generation in chapter 8 kind of suggests there's something not so right about this term. But then here you have sinners as people that Jesus eats with and fellowships with, and and is around in a way that suggests that if nothing else, they're people that are supposed to be gathered in and to have fellowship with. And clearly the allusion to there being, him being a physician in some way who's come to remedy this condition, suggests, something not quite right. But what I think is interesting is that it seems like what you have here in this particular text is you have the scribes of the Pharisees and their kind of class or group of people wanting to be the ones who identify who the sinners are, who are the people that should be excluded, who are the people that should be kept out. And so they have a particular way of understanding sinners, and they probably have a particular way of understanding crowds and sinners as well, as people to be excluded and avoided. But Jesus seems to take the word and use the word in a different way, and seems to be willing to use their word, but to take away a lot of the negative baggage that they attach to it. Or at least, I think maybe more accurately, what it seems like Jesus does is just like with the leper, cleansing of the leper. There, Jesus reaches out and touches the leper, and what the society of that time assumed is that the contagion or the issue or the the evil or whatever it was that was causing this problem would spread to other people, if they got too close or if they came in too near to these people who are suffering and in need. But Jesus shows up and shows that actually the opposite happens. Like when you bring healing, um, when you bring the gospel, when you bring the spirit, let's say, into proximity and into closeness with people in need, that actually the that spreads to those people instead of the contagion getting out. And I think that's the way that it seems to operate here. Marcus, in his commentary, says this of Jesus' response, is that it shifts the frame of reference from the Pharisees' anxiety about the contagion of impurity and sin to the human need of the sinners and the new situation created by Jesus's advent, saying when he says, "I have come." In that new situation, holiness rather than sin turns out to be contagious. So the idea that through the Spirit, we are actually able to share the goodness and grace and mercy of God with others. And our concern shouldn't be, how that is going to, how whatever's wrong in their world or in their life is going to contaminate us, but that how we can bring some kind of hope into that situation. I think this is all very difficult because I think that this idea of sin, this idea of who are the sinners, is obviously a constructed term in so many ways. It's a way of labeling, situations that that isn't really helpful when it comes to how we create community and how we create a family, of God's people. So that makes it difficult, I think. But I think that Jesus makes it clear that there are things that harm other people, and that's right to say that misses the mark of what God wants. There's plenty of things, and in chapter 7, he will talk about. In chapter 7, they're talking about, the things that you put in your body as unclean, as the preoccupation of the scribes and the Pharisees. But he's saying that, he talks about the things that come out are the things that are the real problem. And he talks about, sexual sins, robberies, murders, adulteries, actions motivated by greed, wicked actions, deceit, indecency, an evil eye, abusive speech, arrogance, foolishness. I mean, so clearly it's no use in pretending like that there are not ways that people harm other people, and that there is this thing called sin, that and there are people who are sinners, and that in some ways we all fall into that category, and that there is wisdom in being able to identify the things that harm other people, and figuring out ways to stop that from happening. But I think it's more a matter of strategy, more a matter of how you go about doing that separates the Pharisees and Jesus in this sense. Because what the Pharisees are saying is that we will create boundaries and borders and a strict set of order, and that will help us to know who's inside and who's outside, and we will police that, and that will be the way that we honor God. And Jesus is saying we need to identify the things that are harming people and stop them happening. And if your imposition of order is a thing that's harming people, then we have to stop that too. It's not just the things that you identify as sins that are the problem. It's the things that harm people, that are the problem. And I think that, obviously this is maybe the best way for us to begin to, have a freedom when it comes to how we identify the things that we should avoid and stay away from, and what we consider sin. I think it's got, we have to think about who is harmed, how are they harmed, what what does that look like, because I think we get stuck in traditions about what is, what something has been said that is a sin, but we don't understand the context within which it was labeled that, because of the harm in the situation at the time. I think that I think that I think that our dialogue around the Bible and homosexuality is wrapped up in this. There are ways that there's ways that homosexuality is talked about in the Bible, or let's be clear that that term is not there. So it's not directly that. It is things that we label as that now are addressed in the Bible, and we are unaware of the concrete ways that the authors are addressing something that was caught up in a matrix of harm, that's the issue, and not other situations that we look at today and just label with this blanket term that's not really a biblical term anyway. So, and that's just one example. There's all kinds of examples of ways that we we criminalize certain behavior politically and in our world, and then we call it crime, and we call it illegal, and we call it against against God and country to do these things, when in fact, like, it's just made up. It has nothing to do with with a harm that that we should that God is concerned about. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that, and I think there's a lot to us trying to figure out this idea of sin and sinners, especially when it appears so infrequently in the Gospel of Mark. Now, we can look at it in other places and come back to that if we if you need to, but I want to just end by going to that last place that this idea of sinners comes up is in Mark 14. And it's interesting because it talks about the Son of Man being handed over handed over to the hands of sinners. And the same dynamic that we've been talking about with Jesus, reaching out to the leper, and cleanliness or holiness or whatever, going to them instead of them that coming back. In 14, where it says that Son of Man is handed over into the hands of sinners, it's interesting because Mark is thought of as this apocalyptic gospel, and in Daniel, the key apocalyptic text that people would have read at this time, you have the Son of Man coming, and it's kind of like all of this authority and power is handed over to this Son of Man to kind of deal with the sinners. But in Mark's gospel, just as John was handed over to the authorities, the Son of Man is handed over to sinners, and in placing himself, even in his death, ultimately in proximity and in the hands of sinners, again, Jesus actually forgives sin and redeems people from the state of sin in the world. I think it really helps. Mark is trying to help us understand how crossing these barriers, crossing these barriers is important. Getting into the space, right? Getting into the space where people are being harmed and are being hurt, and bringing healing is what Mark's Jesus is about. And that's where even the things that we might call sin, and the things that make people sinners, are not things that bar them from having an encounter with Jesus, and getting up and following, and becoming someone who brings hope and healing instead of harm. I see that Leonard has something here. Let's see. I was reading an article. Let me put it up. You can see it. Revision of the RSV. Yeah. I think. Yeah, we brought this term in because it's a convenient term for a way that we talk about things. But there are, and it's debated back and forth about what was going on at the time that made these things. There's a very interesting argument about what's happening in Romans, in Romans chapter 1 into 2. I'm forgetting my Romans now, but that section there that talks about God giving people up because of what people read into that as these homosexual acts or whatever. And I think it's Neil Elliott who has a really good reading about what was going on in the imperial palace at the time, and how many of the people in the Roman church, in the Roman churches, were people who were slaves or servants within the Roman court, and how they were forced into these acts, and then that there was a very strict power dynamic involved in that. And it's not necessarily a censure of a certain kind of relationship, but a censure of these acts of harm that were taking place because of the situation of dominance and oppression. But anyway, I mean, that's a little bit outside the purview. I mean, I think there's other ways we can talk about this as well. I mean, the ways that poor people are criminalized, and we don't call it necessarily sin, but we think of it as that they're ethically corrupt in a way that they don't deserve our attention or our compassion to some degree. I was just listening to something the other day talking about cases of where Child Protective Services have been called in, and kids get taken away from their families, and like 63 or something % of those cases are all what they call neglect. And many of those cases of neglect, if you look at what that means, it means that the people are poor, and like the kid doesn't have a coat in the winter, or I mean, these sorts of things where people are being criminalized, and their home life is destroyed because we are labeling something a crime, when really we are creating a system. We are participating in a system that is keeping people impoverished and putting them in that situation. And that could go for all kinds of different crimes, the ways we criminalize things. Anyway, thanks again. Thanks for Thanks for contributing again, Leonard. Should have. It was good to be with you. Good to be with you last week, and we'll have to have you back on. Probably would have. I just rambled on for 37 minutes. We probably could have had a much better conversation. We'll have to do that again. Yeah. So thanks a lot for hanging out, everybody. We've got two more controversies. Or 3 more controversies to come in this section. So look forward to that. We'll get into hopefully get into the spicier side of Jesus with his retorts. So thanks a lot, and I will see you all next week.